So I'm joined now on the Standcast by Rick Belden. Thanks for joining me, Rick.
You're welcome. Very glad to be here.
It's good to have you. And as your website notes, you explore men's issues and masculinity through your writing, through poetry, through art. How'd you end up on this path?
Well, I guess I've been at it for about 30 years now. I was in my late 20s, and I was extremely miserable, and felt like I had run out of options. I was about age 28, and that's the age when friends were starting to get married, they were starting to settle down, and I found myself alone a lot. I was not able to sustain relationships with women.
Okay.
I was unhappy in my work. I was having some problems with my health, and I didn't understand why. I have a lot of bad habits: drinking, smoking pot, going to hookers. I was doing a lot of stuff that, you can do that stuff, and then you kind of get to a point where it's like, this really can't be it. There's got to be more than this.
It's not working for you.
No, it wasn't. And I was so miserable that I had someone broke up with me like right before Thanksgiving of 1986, I think. And I was just so completely devastated and felt so alone that I just decided, okay, if I'm not feeling better after the first of the year, then I'm going to break the family prohibition against asking for help. And I'm going to see if I can find somebody that can help me sort some of this stuff out. And as it happened, a couple months later, I was reading a local publication here in Austin. They had a cover profile with a man named John Lee, who actually went on to become rather big in the men's movement in the late 80s and early 90s. He was still working out of his house at that point. And I thought, well, this guy's story, he was very open about his story. So, wow, it sounds a lot like me. So maybe he can help me. And so that's how I got involved in men's work. He was running counseling groups with his partner, Dan Jones. So I got into some men's groups for the first time, which was quite a trip at first. And I started having a very active dream life. My creativity started coming back. I started writing poetry. I started doing art again, and just kind of reclaiming myself. A lot of parts of myself that I had left behind during childhood, during adolescence especially. And I started to develop a better relationship with myself, which was something I didn't realize I needed. But that was actually the thing I needed the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This prohibition against asking for help, you mentioned.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, my family, I was born in 1957, so I grew up during the 60s, came of age during the mid to late 70s and early 80s. And in my family, the family culture was, we take care of our own business. We don't go outside the family and talk about what's happening inside the family unless we're presenting the family in a positive light.
Yeah.
And if you're having a problem, you need to handle it yourself, because we don't talk about things outside. Everything's actually quite normal. And if you're having a problem, then you have to figure it out, because anything other than that is being weak and basically betraying the family. So that was very strong in me, and I was conditioned along those lines, and it was very challenging for me at first to do that, because that whole element of like, well, I'm not handling my business, and if I talk about things that happened when I was a kid to someone who's not in the family, then I'm just betraying, everybody
right.
by doing that. Yeah.
And so you develop ways of handling your business that turn out to be harmful to yourself and maybe to some other people as well. And so when you started to get help, was there some guilt around betraying the family?
Yes, absolutely.
By getting help, yeah.
Yeah, and there was initially I was very closed about it because I had a lot of shame about it, because I felt like a big failure. And so the first couple of 2-3 months, I don't know if I told anybody.
Really?
And then as I started to feel that it was helping me, I felt like, well, wow, my family's actually pretty messed up, and I'd like everybody to get help, and I'd really like everybody to know what I'm doing, because I'd like them to be part of this process. I want to bring them in. That was not successful.
No,
that was not successful, because then the whole culture of like, oh, you are betraying the family, really came up. And then I did the worst thing possible, which was I wrote a poetry book about my experiences. And then I was, persona non grata for several years, and still am with some members of the family, and they never got over it. So it's a real thing. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't making it up. It wasn't something I was just carrying around in my head as some sort of fiction, that there would be consequences if I did that. There were consequences, and they continued to linger with some people, and there doesn't seem to be anything I can do about it. And that's just that I had to make peace with that, because I had to save myself.
Yeah. So was the art and poetry, was that part of the therapeutic process? And have you seen that? Have you then used that in your kind of coaching, or was this kind of just your own, your own interest that took you in the artistic direction?
Yes to all of the above.
Okay.
I was yes to all of that. So, yeah. So what happened with me was I started having an enormous amount of dreams, and I started journaling a lot, because I'm a writer by nature. It's what I've always wanted to do. So it's very natural for me to start journaling. And one of the interesting things I noticed as I journaled was the first couple of years, everything I wrote was, you're messing up, you're not doing this, you're not doing. It was like I was talking to somebody else. And I was reading through it one day, and I went, why am I talking to myself as if I'm some other person? And who's saying these things? And so that was a big shift from you to I. And then as I started with the counseling and the groups, I started to have a lot of dreams. And I started journaling those too. And I had a series of dreams that intrigued me very much about a character who's very well known in popular culture now, not very well known in the late 80s in American popular culture, which was Iron Man. I loved Iron Man as a kid, and I bought the comic books, and I canned it and everything. And, then I got to be a certain age, 11 or 12, and it's just like, this isn't cool, so I ditched it all. And then in my, 28, 29, 30, I had at least 100 dreams about Iron Man, all different kinds of situations and so forth. And I was having a lot of dreams in general too. And I was trying to journal, and I had all this detail, and I had this idea one day. It's like, well, I wonder if I write these dreams down as poems rather than as prose, maybe I can relieve myself of trying to get all this information recorded. And I started to do that. And around the same time, a guy that I became friends with at the Austin Men's Center decided to run a poetry group for men. And I said, I think I'd like to do that. And the first meeting, he said, bring one poem that you've written. And I was like, I haven't written a poem since high school. And then I realized it's like, I have this dream that I'd written as a poem. So I brought that. And between that and all the Iron Man dreams, it just kind of ignited this big creative process in me. And I got very obsessed about Iron Man for a couple of years, and went to comic book stores and bought all the old comic books that I used to have, and bought little action figures, and made collages and did all this stuff. And the output from that in part was my first poetry book, which is called Iron Man Family Outing, Poems About Transition into a More Conscious Manhood. That came out in 1990. And again, nobody knew who Iron Man was.
Yeah, right.
I was a few years ahead of the curve on that.
That's great.
So yes, I found that the dream work, the journaling, the poetry, the art, those were all sort of vehicles and modes and methodologies that were very natural for me, that I had, most of which I had abandoned at various points due to feeling like, well, it's not cool for men to do art, or there's all kinds of stupid shit that we buy into. And so so as a result of all that, I found that these are good ways for me to process things. These are good ways for me to represent and express and externalize my feelings. I think and this is part of what I like to do with people in coaching, is that very thing. It's very easy to try to process everything rationally and cognitively and analytically. And there's so much information that's in your unconscious, that's in your body, that's nonlinear, that is completely honest and makes absolute sense and ties the room together, as the dude would say. And it's sort of, it's a little hard for people at first, because they're like, well, I'm not an artist, or,
right.
you just have to, the way to work it is to just work with what you have. So like my development of artistic skills, refined skills, stopped at about 7th grade. And so I felt stuck for a while. It's like, well, I don't know how to do anything. It's like, no, you can do a lot of things. You can do collages. You can do all kinds of like post-processing on photos that you take, and just play around with things and really just play with stuff. Play was so important to that process. And I felt so crazy so many times. I just spent, I took time off between a technical contract.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, I just spent 4 hours playing with my Iron Man action figure today. What's wrong with me? But I was reconnecting with, aspects and ages of myself that I had abandoned.
Now you have me wanting to go grab my son's Iron Man guys and just hang out and play for a little bit.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I might do it.
Yeah. So that's kind of how things, that's all of this sort of developed in the space of a couple of years. And that's pretty much the template that I've been using, with myself and with other people now ever since.
Okay. I'm gonna quote something that you wrote here, and it's that men often keep the depth and complexity of their inner lives fairly well hidden. Why is that?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. I know in my case, and I think it's true for probably most men, there's a point during your boyhood, and actually there are several points, where if you're naturally open, which most children are, mm-hmm. you're going to have some experiences that discourage you from continuing along that path. Basically, you find out through, it can be in the family, it can be from older siblings, it can be from peers, it can be in the school from teachers or coaches, it can be from girls as well as other boys. Mm-hmm. You get that message that like, hey, that thing you're doing is weird. It's kind of gay. That's really not how boys are supposed to be. And of course, I'm talking about things like, I remember one time I challenged some guy to a fight after school in junior high because he pushed me in line at the cafeteria or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so, it's one of these things where it was announced in advance, which is a terrible idea. So everybody showed up, Yeah. And I took one swing at him and he just laid me out. And I was there on the sidewalk and I just busted out crying, because it hurt and I was so ashamed.
Ashamed, right?
Everybody was around me. And I mean, that it's really clear. Nobody came up to me and said, hey man, it's okay. I was alone and I was completely humiliated and ashamed and I was hurt, embarrassed and alone. And I knew that I had failed to assert myself, as a male. It's funny. I hadn't even thought about that one in a long time, but I think most of us, through our boyhood and teenage years, we tend to accumulate more than one of those kind of experiences, where we realize that like, if we wind up raw and open around other people, probably nobody's going to be there. So in that case, everybody just walked away. I'm sure people were laughing,
mm-hmm.
So that was so I got the abandonment and the shaming with that. And I think that's common. And I think commonly, in addition to the abandonment and the shaming, when boys are open at that point and they haven't learned to control it yet, there's often a physical punishment component too, which I received at home. The classic thing, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to cry for.
Yeah, right.
I got that, and I knew that it was serious. And so that has lingered with me. And also, there's just certain, and I don't know, I'm not a 14-year-old boy now. I don't know what it's like for 14-year-old boys, but I think there's still a lot of elements there of like, there's certain social pressure that there are certain marks that you have to hit in order to be considered to be a proper masculine teenage boy. Now, I was not good at sports. I was really clumsy. But I was so eager to hit some of those marks that I went for sports anyway. And I was terrible at first. But I did prove to other boys that like, well, he's not just a smart kid. He can also play sports. So I'm glad I did those things. I did a lot of things. Some were positive like that. Some were negative. A lot of the drinking and the partying and the insanity that I did, in my teens and early 20s was to go, hey, I can hang in there. I'm just as good as you are. It's like, So I did a lot to cover up my natural vulnerability, my natural sensitivity. I stopped doing art because it's like, well, those art kids are weird. Everybody thinks they're weird. I don't want to be, have people think I'm any weirder than I already am. And I took a very blue collar job right out of high school. I didn't go to college. I went and worked in a sawmill for a year and a half because I came out of a blue collar system, and I wanted to prove to my dad and my uncles and my grandfathers that, like, hey, I'm a real man just like you are.
You're tough.
Exactly. And again, so it kind of it's all along that same line of, where we started with the question. Is like, if you're at all perceptive as a boy, that there are certain things that you have to do, and it's not necessarily a bad. I've built a lot of resilience, and that I needed in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying it's negative to do those things, but I also lost a lot because nothing in anything I just told you about was about me being encouraged to be vulnerable, for me to develop my emotional intelligence, or to develop any kind of language that I could use to communicate my inner states. Those are the things that tend to get lost when you're trying not to get hit by a log all day long.
Right. Yeah. And we don't perceive the expression of vulnerability as strength. We perceive it as weakness, particularly in men.
Yes.
And that's obviously something we've got to work on and change. I want to get briefly, at least, to an article you wrote about highly sensitive men.
Mm-hmm.
For people who aren't familiar with that term, high sensitivity or highly sensitive, can you describe what that means?
Yes, it is based on a physiological trait. It was first identified by a clinical psychologist named Dr. Elaine Aron back in the mid to late 90s. The clinical term for it is sensory processing sensitivity. And the general idea of it is, and this is based on her studies over the last 25 years or however long, the idea is that roughly 1 in 5, 15 to 20% of all people meet her criteria for high sensitivity. And that, surprisingly enough, is equally distributed across men and women.
Okay.
So roughly you can say 1 in 5 men is meet her criteria for high sensitivity. So what that means in practical terms is that if you're a highly sensitive person, you tend to have a higher intake of sensory information, which can be visual, auditory, energetic, feelings, all sorts of things like that. You're taking in more information. You have a higher capacity and a higher bandwidth to take in more information from the environment around you, which could be people, places, activity, all that kind of stuff. And so along with that, there is a tendency or rather a need to process things more fully and more thoroughly at a deeper level. And so it really is a physiological personality trait that has to do with how much information you take in and what your capacity is for holding it, and what your need is for processing it. So there's a wider bandwidth. Things tend to go in at deeper depth, at more depth. And there's also just sort of a native mode, which is about really wanting to understand, really being thorough, really wanting to feel prepared. And also along with that, you can be easily overwhelmed because there's so much information processing going on all the time, again, whether it's emotional or analytical or whatever. So it's not a disorder. It's a trait that has, like any other personality trait, that has positive and negative aspects, and it can be particularly problematic for men because of all the things we just talked about. Generally speaking, sensitivity in men is not regarded as a positive thing. It is regarded as a problem, and it is often used as a club to basically beat a man down.
Mm-hmm. Looked at as weakness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Looked at as weakness, looked at as a defect, and something to be hidden, and something to be ashamed of, and something to repress. and something to not know about. So there's kind of an uphill climb in terms of building awareness for this, because when I encountered this at the point in my life, which was probably 15 years ago or something like that, I happened to be at a bookstore. Remember those? And I was thumbing through some books, and I just my hand just landed on this one, and I said, "What is this?" And I opened it, and I just randomly read through it, which is how I read a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, "Well, this is me. I've never seen this. I had never seen my sensitivity addressed or described as something positive.
Yeah.
I had always experienced it as like, you're too sensitive. Why are you like this?
Something you want to hide.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. And and more than that, something that should be changed.
Yeah.
And so that's what I spent a good chunk of my life from, like probably the age of 10 or 11 or 12 until I was in my late 40s when I first encountered this material. I was like, well, I have to change because all the messages that I'm getting about this are that there's something wrong with me.
So even while you were doing men's work, you were still wanting to change the sensitive aspect to yourself.
Yeah. And it's it's one of those things that you can't change it, and that goes to that's why I think the physiological basis of it is so important to emphasize. It's not a choice. It's not when people say, "Oh, stop being so sensitive," it's like, I can't, and so there's some skill building that highly sensitive people get to do once they find out that they fit these criteria. And it's certainly something that's manageable, and it's a great advantage in a lot of situations. But again, for men, it's challenging, because it's considered to be not desirable to say that.
Yeah. And in your article, in the essay that you wrote on being a highly sensitive man, you linked to something that Ted Zeff wrote on highly sensitive men or boys, and he describes a number of qualities of someone with a highly sensitive male, and he wrote their compassion, that they're compassionate, gentle, the act as a peacekeeper, concerned about the humane treatment of animals, sense of responsibility, awareness of unity with all beings. It made me think with my religious background of someone like Jesus or other religious figures. Is it common among religious leaders, or is there maybe a set of professions or something that people go into who are more highly sensitive?
I think it certainly makes sense that it would be or could be. When I think about the kind of professions and livelihoods and work that draw highly sensitive people, I would think of artists, poets, musicians, people that work in the spiritual realm, as you were saying. And also I would think, when I think about it, it's like even someone who's an architect, or someone who is a massage therapist, or a healer, or some kind of caregiver, a teacher, potentially. So I think there's a lot of range there in terms of what sorts of things these folks might be attracted to. And of course, if you're talking about 1 in 5 men, you're going to be talking about auto mechanics, IT guys, the whole span, because men who are highly sensitive typically aren't going to know that, if they ever find out, until they're well into their lives, or 30s or 40s maybe. And at that point, they've often chosen what their livelihood is.
Right.
And so, you could have a highly sensitive auto mechanic, and you could go, yeah, I really like dealing with him because he pays attention. He talks to me, he listens, and so it's possible anywhere in any profession now.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we had someone listening who maybe struggles with not feeling like they're man enough, that they haven't enough so-called manly qualities, what would you say to that person?
Well, I guess a couple things. If what we're saying about highly sensitive people sounds at all like you, I would say that the best thing I can recommend is to go to Dr. Elaine Aron's Highly Sensitive Person website and take the self-test there. She has a very good self-test. And if you meet the criteria, I would say read her book and learn about yourself. If the question is more general, I think that a good first place to start is to start to observe, as I said very early on, how do you talk to yourself? Because that's where we live in how we talk to ourselves,
Yep.
More than anything else. And that affects us far more than anything anybody else says, especially as adults, But that's what I would say is to begin to pay attention to how you talk to yourself during the day.
Our voice that we hear more than anybody else's voice, right?
Yeah, exactly. What sorts of things do you say to yourself? And if you actually pay attention to it, how does it feel? If you're hateful to yourself, in a certain situation, or you're just, I'm still pretty relentless with myself. I drive myself way too hard sometimes, and these are hard things to unlearn. But the first thing you have to do, if you want to understand better how you relate to yourself and how you see yourself, then try to listen to how you talk to yourself during the day, because that will tell you a lot.
Well, that was going to lead into my last question. So it's possible that your response might be connected to that. And that is, if you were to recommend one practice for men who are striving to be better men, however you would define that, what practice would you recommend?
In addition to what I just said, the other thing I would recommend is to slow down whenever you can. Mm-hmm. Slow down whenever you can, and check in with what you're feeling and where you're feeling it in your body. Because as men, that's another thing that happens. It happened to me. I think it happens to a lot of men. We tend to experience our bodies as being very mechanical and not really us, and distant from us, and it's like functional. It's functional. It's performance oriented. I was talking to the guy recently, and I said, hold up your right hand and look at it and tell me what you see. He said, well, I see something that's functional. I can use it to write. I can use it to, he said, masturbate. I could use, he listed a bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. I said, and he was right-handed. I said, hold up your left hand and tell me what you see. And he said, a useless object. So, you can learn a lot about how you see your body just by doing little exercises like that. But so much of the time, if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling worried, if you're feeling angry, it's just so useful to begin to develop the skill of beginning to identify where in your body you're feeling that. And if you can put a word to it, or if there's a color, or if a person comes up or whatever, because our body really is the gateway to understanding how we're feeling and what we're carrying around with us that's influencing us that we don't realize.
It tells us a lot about ourselves. And
it absolutely does.
If we're not in touch, then...
Yeah, and it's right there all the time. Yeah. It's available to you all the time, everywhere you go.
I'm sure that guy would have moved that useless left arm if you'd had a hammer in your hand. We're just going to lower it down.
You know what I did? I said, okay, I want you, between now and the next time we talk, I want you to do a writing exercise with your left hand and share with me what comes out.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. That's another part of this, Dwayne, is like it's not just that we're kind of divorced and separated from our bodies as a whole. It's not equal, all the way through. It's right. Like he had some kind of functional understanding of his relationship with his right hand. His left hand, even though he uses it all day long, obviously, he admits it.
Recognize it.
Yeah. So, that's how profound, these sort of patterns that we live in can be when we actually see them. And you go, well, I wouldn't want to be without my left hand. It's not useless, but that's the world that's the kind of matrix, that we're walking around with in relation to our bodies. I know for me, my body awareness, like most of the time, well, it stops around my groin. It's like, I don't have a good sense of my feet. The farther I get away from my head, the less sense I have of, what's going on, and the less sort of conceptually, I don't understand my feet very well because like they're so far away from where all the action is.
That's funny that you say this because it makes me think about my marriage. My wife is a runner, so she probably starts with her feet, whereas I'm starting with my head. So that there might be some things we need to work on with that. I'll have to give that some thought.
There's some interesting possibilities there, metaphorically, if nothing else.
Yeah, that's great. So how do people find you?
My coaching site is rickbeldencoaching.com.
Okay.
That's the best place to find me. And I do offer a free 1-hour discovery session with new people where we can explore their situation. Fantastic. And identify some options for moving forward. Especially, I like to work with people who feel stuck, because that's how I started. I felt stuck, so I can identify with that. And I do work with women as well as men.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. One last question. Does Robert Downey Jr. have your book of poetry?
Not that I'm aware of.
You haven't sent him a copy, huh?
No.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you need to remedy that, I think.
I'll think about it. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks for joining us today.
Okay. Yeah, it was great. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.